Good afternoon. Uh, my name is Olga Mayorova. I'm director of GREECE. And before I tell you about our today's event, a few words about the upcoming event. Our next GREECE Noon lecture will take place on March 14. And the documentary filmmaker Mila Turajlic will give a lecture on cinema comunisto. So the night before, actually, on March 13, it will be screening of cinema comunisto in U of M Museum of Art, Helmut Stern Auditorium. So please mark your calendar. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our new colleague, professor from School of Natural Resources and Environment, Josh Newell. Josh Newell focuses his research on relationship between urban sustainability, resource consumption, and environmental change. He studies the flows and dynamics of governance within global commodity networks as a means to explore the connections between the urban consumer and resource-based regions. His research also focuses on the metabolisms of urban infrastructure and how they can be reshaped to forge more sustainable cities. His work has been published in a number of journals, prestigious peer-reviewed journals, and he's the co-author of 2 books on environmental issues in Russia: The Russian Far East, Biodiversity Hotspots and Industrial Developments, published in 1996, and the same title, The Russian Far East, but completely different subtitle, A Reference Guide for Conservation and Development, published in 2004. Please join me in welcoming Josh.
Thank you. Can everyone see the screen okay? Should I?
Hard to see.
Is it? Should I turn off the light maybe, or put us all to sleep?
Helping? That is helping.
Okay, I can still see here, so that's
Can you
good.
see now?
Yes, I can. Okay, well, thanks to all of you for coming. I know it's a gorgeous day out there. Just saying, there's already blooms in my garden, so it's a very strange winter, but I appreciate you all taking the time to come and listen to me today. The title of my talk is China's Urban Ecological Shadow, Contextualizing Resource Flows from Russia's Forests. And really, to just situate this, one of my primary research focuses is how do we bridge this gap between what I call spaces of resource consumption, which happen often in urban settings, with spaces of resource production. So these are these distant peripheries upon which cities and urban cores are very dependent, and yet we're often very disconnected from those spaces. And so we're unaware, particularly of the impacts of consumption on those distant places and spaces. And I use consumption quite broadly, not just to denote a bottle of water, but also the resource flows which sustain and flow through a city. So water flows, energy flows. It's this spatial coupling between this production and consumption relationship that really interested me the most. And so in my work, I've had 2 very distinct trends of research. I was trained as an urban ecologist, and much of the focus was very bounded in the city, ecology in the city, if you will, and also trained to think about Russian wood flows, particularly Russian-Chinese wood flows. So a lot of my work is trying to bring together these 2 worlds, and I find thinking about making these connections between these seemingly disconnected yet intimately interconnected places and spaces. Just to give you a little more background, I worked for an environmental organization, Friends of the Earth, in the 90s. I was based in Tokyo, and in 1994, a foundation officer descended on our little Tokyo office and asked if anybody knew anything about Siberian forests. And I didn't know anything about Siberian forests, but I was 23 at the time and decided, sure, I'd volunteer. So basically, we received a number of grants to do forest conservation in Siberia and eastern Russia. And so I moved over to Vladivostok in 1994 and spent the better part of that decade kind of working between the two places. Very rural, or sort of very frontier place, and then also very much an urban core of Tokyo. Vladivostok is its own urban core, I should say. But at any rate, so I did a lot of work. I worked on forest issues. I also worked on the oil and gas issues off of the coast of Sakhalin Island. I worked on corruption issues. And that's really what led to these two books that were mentioned, really reference texts to the region. And increasingly got interested in Chinese consumption, particularly with respect to the forest flows. And so what I'm presenting to you today is really two works in progress. I didn't know which one to present, so I'm going to try to present both in an abbreviated way. They're connected, but somewhat distinct. The first is really understanding the changing dynamics of stressors in Russian forests over time. And the second is really to think about how we might govern or create a form of global governance through the products that we consume, specifically by looking at a global commodity chain product. And this is a forest flow that moves into China, into northeastern China, where there's manufacturing taking place. Obviously, I'm focusing specifically on flooring and furniture, and then exported to do-it-yourself retail multinationals like Walmart and IKEA as a way to ground this. So I'm going to try to present both of these today. I may not get through the whole part of the second talk or portion, but I will try. So I'll move quite swiftly. So this is the structure of essentially these two pieces, if you will. The first is about the shifting dynamics of production and consumption spaces, using a Russian forest as the focal point. And the second is thinking about ways to reconnect production and consumption by literally bringing Siberia into the home of the urban dweller through China. So thinking about that. So just a little more background of my take of Russian scholarly research or scholarly research on the Russian environment. Much of it, as I see it, remains very firmly nested within the confines of the nation state, in this case Russia. So causes and proposed responses to environmental degradation then tend to originate within a sharply delineated sense of region. Okay? But if we think about regions these days, particularly places like the Russian Far East, they're not discrete and self-contained, but they're actually shaped by other territories and places. They're fluid spaces and very much connected. So the logic follows, if you want to understand environmental problems and issues, you have to think beyond this single confine. But in thinking about a lot of the research, so this is the last point, that in this sense region becomes reified because you're not looking at these interconnections. And borders in actuality and regions are porous and partial and continually reconstituted and affected by those other spaces within which they interact. Okay? So okay. Sorry, I got a little lost here. At any rate, connected to this, because of this reified sort of sense of region and this atomistic focus, much of the environmental problems are viewed through what we might consider the production angle, which is really focused on looking at the wanton inefficiencies of the production process and finding ways to reduce that pollution and that impact. This is just a quote from Thomas Princeton, who's actually in our school, the School of Natural Resources, and he's done a lot of thinking about production and consumption. And so what I've tried to do is to try to rethink how we think about environmental problems in Russia through more of an integrated production-consumption dynamic lens. So try to thinking about where the product is going and what's being consumed. Doing this actually frees you up to think about this region of Russia as a more porous place that interacts with other spaces. It's a very powerful way to think about it, particularly from a resource point of view. So I find it a very helpful frame of reference to think about this. Not to privilege consumption at the expense of production, but to think of them as a dynamic that interacts together. And I'll explain more about this as we move along. Much of the Russian research that I've looked at on the environment is very much focused on what we think of as the production angle. Very much associated with problems and inefficiencies associated with production. It has very strong roots in Soviet-based environmental scholarship, very production, place-centric approaches. And this, I think, had a lot more salience during the Soviet Union because of the structure of the economy. It was very much internally bound, right? But things have very much changed. Nonetheless, it's difficult to find research on the Russian environment that actually tries to look at this in a very transboundary way. And yet, resources flow across borders. Especially wood, oil and gas as well, fisheries, other examples. Transition era studies also continue this legacy with really a specific focus on inefficient production, documentation of wanton use of resources, and pollution. And just some scholars that focus in this vein. So my claim is that really to understand some of the most causes of some of the most serious environmental problems, we have to look at it from a multi-scalar interdependent context. And so I've been thinking about ways to think of a new conceptual framework that embraces both this consumption angle and this production angle into an integrated whole. And so I just want to walk through very briefly with you a case study of post-Soviet Russian forest degradation, specifically looking at Eastern Russia. So here is the forests of Russia. They're 20% of the world's forests, about 50% of the world's remaining coniferous forests, and about 18% of what we might call frontier forests. These are largely intact forest massifs of at least 50,000 hectares. And that is denoted in the green blobs here. So you're talking about an enormous forest resource base that's still very much intact. Interestingly, if you look at timber production statistics, so you have a sharp rise in the 60s, and you have tremendous production all the way until perestroika, which is about here, and you have this steep decline in production. This graph shows timber production statistics for all the major federal districts of Russia over the last 60 years or so. So you can see a little bit of a serious bottoming out and then a little bit of a rebound here, but nothing like what we had during the height of the Soviet period. And most of this timber was consumed internally, about 95% of it actually. But by 1995, this had shifted so that about 22% of all roundwood, basically wood that's not processed, so it's basically just a round stick, was exported. And this increased to almost a third by 2007. So the reason I'm showing you the statistics is to show you that basically the flows of the resource is no longer within the frame that is Russia, very much a frame that's increasingly through Northeast Asia. And so when we think about this and we think about the region, because of the flows of these resources and the flows of the currency as well, you have to think about this in a much more production consumption sort of way and much more of a dynamic sense of region. Particularly in the Far East, where I tend to do a lot of my work, about 70% of all wood that's produced is exported, almost entirely to China, Korea, and Japan. This shows sort of the rise in export. You can see here, this is obviously the watershed period, post-Soviet period. So you can see as production has increased, as has export as well. Now, timed with this, you have this remarkable change in China, basically. This is really a watershed period in China, about 1998, when China instituted the Chinese National Forest Protection Program, which greatly reduced logging in many parts of China. And what it did is it led to a sharp demand and increase from many other countries for wood, with Russia being the primary supplier. This is also timed with the period when Chinese wood manufacturing industries really started to take off. Taiwanese investment came in a bit earlier, but a lot of foreign investment. So these two factors, this drying up of domestic production, as well as this great rise and increasing capacity of wood manufacturing in China, led to this massive rise. And you can see this is a graph showing Russian timber export to Northeast Asia. Today, China supplies about 40%, or Russia supplies about 40% of all wood, roundwood consumed in China. So it's a really important source for China. China is the world's largest importer of wood in the world. So we might think about this as an ecological shadow, right? That China is basically protecting its own resource at the expense of I'm getting to that. I'm setting this up, so you'll see in a minute. So maybe wait till I finish my line, and I'll get to you. So we could think of this as China's ecological shadow, and I'll explain why this is not the case in a minute. But essentially, to give you a sense of the landscape of where Chinese or Russian wood is being exported to China, basically the heart of it is in Siberia and the southern Russian Far East. So the circles denote the amount of timber export to China. But if you look more deeply into thinking about this idea of ecological shadow, this is true within the lens of sort of a nation-state binary. But within the broader political economy, China is just a series of nodes on a more complex transnational commodity network. According to research by Forest Trends, about two-thirds of two-thirds of all Chinese production of furniture and flooring, two-thirds of that comes, the wood sourced for that comes from abroad, essentially. So a vast majority of the wood that China uses, particularly hardwoods, is used for export product. Okay, it's different for softwood, but for hardwood, particularly the hardwood that comes from the Russian Far East, the vast majority of that is used for export products. Okay, so most of this wood is not actually being consumed in China. It is in the sense that it's being processed, but the end user are actually countries in Europe and the United States, and to some degree Japan. So China is now the world's largest exporter of finished wood products in the world, world's largest exporter of flooring products as well.
You're saying China is the largest importer of wood and the largest exporter?
Yeah.
Okay.
And when you think about it, for the China's booming urban cores, a lot of the Russian softwood, the pine, is going for paneling and for construction material for cities. But for places in the Russian Far East, including Korean pine, but mostly the hardwoods, a lot of that wood is being processed in China, and some of it's being sold on the Chinese domestic market. But a lot of the furniture and flooring being produced in Northeast China is actually being exported, at least the stuff that's using Russian wood. So we think about this, and it's a much more dynamic picture. It's not just China as consumer, but it's much more of a dynamic, globalized network. That's my point. So.
Is the total consumption of the wood in the world increasing?
Yes, it is increasing. Yeah, primarily because of the rise of paper consumption. So you have a lot more pulp production and paper consumption.
What is the paper consumption being used for? I mean, what,
People are not
if
buying
everybody's
newspapers.
going green and everything is online, what is the...
I don't know if paper consumption's going down, actually. A lot of people print everything that they read online. I haven't seen, I think that it is starting to dip a bit. I don't know the exact statistics, but
Didn't mean to interrupt you. Go
yeah,
ahead.
that's okay. So consumption is going up, yeah, globally.
Maybe we will reserve questions for the end.
So this graph illustrates the massive rise in exports of value-added wood products from China to other countries. It shows just the top 6, but you can see here. So this is basically when China started implementing the forest protection program. Also the time when they started importing lots of Russian wood, and you can see just the massive rise in export of wood products. So interesting. Japan has been an importer for a number of years. So getting just back to this narrative of stressors of Russian forests, really it's a combination of things. It's the collapse of domestic demand in Russia, outdated machinery in Russia, the lure of hard currency abroad. What this did is it spawned an industry almost completely reliant on the production and export of roundwood and logs rather than value-added processing such as sawnwood, veneer, and things like that. So Russia has not benefited nearly as well as they could because of this lack of value-added production. Okay, so really, it's a major source of degradation because I'll explain more in a minute, but it basically drives where and how forests are being harvested in Russia. Despite production going way down, you'll see, I'll give you a specific case of forests in the southern Far East. So combined with this, privatization and liberalization in Russia with large unemployment led to a sharp increase in the number of timber exporters to China and Japan, as well as harvesters. The graph on the right here shows the rapid increase in the number of licensed timber exporters to China. So this explosion in the number of actors could not have come at a worse time, as it coincided with the weakening of the Forest Service in Russia and the Committee of Environmental Protection. Both are crucial state institutions for forest management and use. So with the weaker control, there has been a sharp rise in illegal logging and general creation of a frontier mentality with respect to forest use. Roads are being illegally punched through intact forests. Protected areas are being logged. Logging is occurring along river systems. This is a picture of a regional Forest Service office. Much of my fieldwork is focused on the Ecological region here, which is in the southern Russian Far East. It extends for about 1,000 miles north to south. It escaped the last periods of glaciation, so these forests have evolved to become one of the most diverse assemblages of plants and animal species of any temperate forest on the planet. This map shows the remaining high-value conservation forests, essentially, that were mapped in detail. And a lot of my field work focused on this specific region here. So tree species, basically of the boreal, also thrive here in combination with temperate and subtropical species. So you have this wonderful mixture of plants and animals. So you have Korean pine and ginseng together, and liana vines, growing through this dense canopy of forest. This is the Bikini River. It's 700,000 hectares of roadless forest. It's really what we call the heart of the Ecological. And a lot of my work in Russia was focused on preserving parts of this forest and the northern Samarga forest up here as well. So you have species like the Siberian tiger. There's about 400 left in the world. This is really their primary home. There is a little bit of habitat in China, but primarily it's in the Ecological. So in the Ecological, what I found is it's not necessarily the total amount of logging that's taking place, but the demand for specific species that is the cause of deep forest degradation. Primoria is very close to China and Japan and very sensitive to the consumer preferences and demand preferences of those two countries. What's happening, it's very interesting in Russia. I did a spatial analysis of the shift in production, and the production is very much shifting south along the border regions. So Primorsky Krai, Khabarovsk, Amur, Chita, Buryatia, and parts of Karelia too, and along the Finnish border. And you're seeing really a high grading for species in demand. This is Mongolian oak, which is used in flooring all over the world, and Manchurian ash, which is also prized in flooring and furniture. So it's targeting of these particular species in very specific forests. And as a workaround, because a lot of these species are protected, a lot of the habitat remaining is protected, the Forest Service regularly issues what we call sanitary logging licenses, which provide access into protected forests. Okay, so it's sort of a loophole to allow for this to continue because the demand is so high for these particular species and the commercially available tracts are very limited. You're seeing this in greatly abused all over the southern Russian Far East, particularly in Primoria. I visited a number of these sites. This was actually a site where the sanitary logging was allowed. Essentially, it's to remove old trees, sick trees, trees that pose fire threats, which can be used very broadly. What you're seeing is classic high grading here, where they're taking just the heart of the tree and leaving the rest. And you see that I saw this over and over. I worked a little bit with some of the Forest Service officials, and we actually went out and looked at some of these places. It's It's pretty amazing. So on the document it says 10 centimeters, no larger, and you get out there and they're basically high grading. So I need to move to the next piece here, but just to summarize, the case I'm making in this paper, which I'm working on, is that this, if we can understand more fully this shifting production-consumption dynamic, we can more fully grasp the drivers of forest degradation and change in Russia. That we, in fact, have to do this. We have to not only look at production practices and governance in Russia, but we have to think about where the demand is coming from. And in this case, some of the key things I highlighted was the rise of Asian markets, the spatial fracturing of the industry. Before you had conglomerates, a very small number of large enterprises. Now in Russia you have thousands of little operators. So it's very hard for the Forest Service to monitor all these small actors. The weakening of the Forest Service, the Committee of Environmental Protection, continued lack of clarity between Moscow and the Far East. There's been like 7 or 8 revisions of the Forest Code. People in the Far East some of them don't even know where it stands at certain points. It's been completely rehashed and put back together. There's a tremendous opacity with respect to regulatory direction. And in the Psychotalin, what I'm arguing and what I tried to show in this paper is that there's a decline in forest quality, but it's not because of the amount of timber being harvested. It's this demand, it's this driving desire for a high-value species in very specific places and in very sensitive places, such as protected areas. And this is being facilitated by the Forest Service, which is issuing these sanitary logging licenses. So if we want to think about reform of the Russian forest sector and thinking about forest protection and conservation, we have to think not only in Russia, but we have to think about what's happening in places like China, where there is, and the U.S., where there's powerful demand drivers. I'm thinking about how to reshape and regovern those. And that segues into my second piece here, which is thinking about this idea of global commodity chain governance. And I'll try to move quickly through this. Again, it's trying to think about how we can reconnect these spaces of production and consumption. So this urban cores that consume these pieces of furniture and this flooring with places like the Russian Far East. One of the ironies of our urban existence is the more urban we become, the more disconnected we become from the places from where things are produced. And yet we're wholly dependent on these places. I find it fascinating. So the commodity becomes a fetish, in a sense. The social and environmental relations of production are hidden. Exchange is also hidden. And so we have what I call an opacity of distance, right? Physical distance, but also distance because of the multitude of actors in these commodity chains. And this is a thriving research field in geography, really trying to uncover what we call the hidden lives of commodities. So trying to remap and uncover how these things are produced. And so I've gotten very interested in what we call ethical or green consumption. And this is the idea where you make these social and environmental relations transparent. And what's implicit in this is that the consumer has the power through the pocketbook to improve environmental governance. We've all seen cases of green consumption, organic food, fair trade coffee, things like that are just a couple examples. Within this field of green consumerism, there's really 2 main threads. One are alternative trade networks. So we might have a local food network that supplies Ann Arbor. That would be a good example of an alternative trade network. And then we have what we call the greening of large-scale supply networks. So Walmart is going through a greening process of a lot of its supply chains. I focus on the second one, partially because I find it fairly problematic. But nonetheless very interesting and potentially very useful if we're thinking about places like the Far East and we want to improve governance through the consumer node. And this stems from commodity chain theory, which was really popularized by Gary Gareffi, who's a sociologist. It comes from Wallersteinian systems theory. And there's 3 basic crucial characteristics: an input-output structure. So sort of this process of inputs to transformation to distribution to consumption. A territoriality, and this is sort of the spatial distribution of where these chains are located. and then a governance structure. There's increasing research that is arguing that the nation state is weakened as a result of transnational corporations, but also because of these globalized production networks. And so the idea is that you can harness the power of this node, this buyer-driven node or this retail-driven node, and drive information back up the chain as a way to govern and improve environmental standards and social standards. Activists trying to improve these chains, perhaps intuitively focus on the firms as a way to leverage this and as a way to drive change. A lot of the greening that Walmart's undergoing and some of these other companies has really been driven by NGO activism towards that retailer, towards that node. So in this research, essentially, I'm looking, basically trying to answer a number of questions and thinking about, does ethical consumption actually bridge distance? Does it reduce this opacity? Or is it greenwash, essentially? And I'll look at a specific case. If and how is governance rescaled through this process of green consumption and green commodities? And are these commodity chains actually what we call buyer-driven? So I used a Russian case to explore these questions. I looked at big box retailers, specifically IKEA, Home Depot, and Walmart. All three of these have standards, but they self-certify. So they don't have a third-party certifier certifying their commodity networks, their procurement practices. And so what they've done is they've inserted standards in existing supply networks. Okay, and the common feature among all these, there's no sourcing from endangered forests. So remember I showed you that map of frontier forests and high conservation forests? Well, these three have all said they won't import wood from any of these sources, from these high conservation value forests. The key is very specific in that as well. So, but all of them do state that. Here's just an example from Home Depot. We promise to eliminate the purchase of wood and products from endangered forests around the world. We know item by item, from lumber to broom handles, where our products are harvested. So I just found this fascinating. So I actually went on a geographical search, geographic detective work, to bring Russia into the home of the urban dweller, but also to try to interrogate these claims, these truth claims. And so I had three basic goals: bridging distance by bringing Siberia in the city. So I actually went from factory to stump for some of these products. And the idea here, in a more scholarly vein, was actually to build a methodology that other scholars could use to track commodity chains through actor-to-actor connections. Okay, if you want to think about understanding the impacts of the urban core, this is a great way to think through that by linking these sites of production to consumption. Exploring governance, obviously, studying how this information passed up through these actors. And then to expand understanding more generally of transnational corporations and to assess these claims of self-certification. So I actually traveled, did a lot of fieldwork in China and Russia, and traveled backwards from the manufacturing node in China up into Russia. I basically use three main sort of chain of custody, what we call it chain of custody pillars. The first is identification. So anytime you want to establish clear chain of custody of a product between actors, you have to identify the product, right? If one of your suppliers or clients doesn't care about where product is coming from, you have to segment it apart, right? So some Chinese manufacturers are making product for IKEA, so they have to separate that wood because IKEA wants to know where it's coming from. Others don't care. But in the actual facility, you have to segment. And then you need documentation, which provides the information linkage between the actor through the process. And these are often coupled, these chain of custody pillars. So in a sense, I was trying to accomplish these three goals simultaneously: to link Russian harvesters with these international retailers, to examine chain of custody practices at each of these nodes, and more broadly to build a sense of Russian-Chinese a typology, if you will, of Russian-Chinese wood supply networks. About 90% of the corporate links that I uncovered could actually be obtained from the office. I used Russian custom statistics and U.S. custom statistics to actually link these actors throughout. Very powerful information, actually links corporations. The reason I could do so was because we were crossing national boundaries, actually. So you have data sets linking actors. Within China itself was much more difficult. And I used GIS timber concessions from the Forest Service to link the exporters to actual sites of timber harvest. I don't have time to go through all of this now, but I just wanted to show you sort of some of the methods and data that I used. I did a lot of participant observation. I traveled with militia, World Wildlife Fund as well. And basically, just to give you a sense of this, I focused on oak and ash, specifically furniture and flooring, and I focused on companies operating in Dalian, Qingdao, Shanghai, and Harbin. To identify the specific manufacturers in China, I selected 50 export-oriented manufacturers in China. I sent them a questionnaire asking who they were supplying, which international retailer, and where they got their wood. I used customs data to match these folks with the international retailers like IKEA, Walmart, and so on. And then I went and interviewed 20 of these manufacturers. This is actually an IKEA. Does anyone recognize this bowl? These are IKEA bowls manufactured in Qingdao. So the next step was actually to interview the importers. And they tend to be located on the Chinese portion of the Russian-Chinese border. And I actually traveled to import yards. This is in Manjuli, in Inner Mongolia. And what I was interested here, because I had most of the data, I wanted to see how the wood was being segmented and if it was being identified and if there was documentation. And basically it was all just by size and species. There was no sort of documentation at this node, basically. So once we got to this node, it was already all jumbled for the most part. It was by segmentation by species, not by shipment. To link the Chinese importers to the Russian harvest exporters, I used Russian customs data to identify those Russian companies that harvest wood but also export wood. I couldn't focus on all of them, but some of the big companies have licenses to do both. And this allowed me really to locate them in the forest floor itself. So after all that process, I basically identified one specific region in Primorsky Krai in the Sikhotalin. Specifically, and my criteria for these sites was that they be high conservation value forests, that Siberian tigers be present, that they're sanitary logging licenses, so they weren't long-term commercial leases, it's these Forest Service licenses that are issued. And of course the presence of Russian harvesters / exporters. And I actually selected one particular site. This is a protected nut zone in the Bikin River. It's been closed for decades, and in 2004 it was opened for sanitary logging. And then I built spreadsheets linking this particular forest all the way through from the harvester to the importer to the type of product to in this case Lowe's, Home Depot, and Flooring America. So I wasn't able to track the individual log, but I was able to link the corporate actors together. It was impossible to link the individual logs because they're not identifying or segmenting the logs at these key nodes.
So the point is that the product could have come from that forest.
Yeah, because the company that is supplying that has a logging license in that particular forest. So, and I'm pretty sure that at least some of that product is getting into the particular chains of these retailers. I visited some of the timber harvest sites. Need to move quickly here. Some of the processing areas. This is once the timber's harvested, they have these big sort of consolidation zones. It's already mixed up at this point, basically.
Yeah.
This is the key node if you're concerned. because so many different trucks are coming from different logging sites to consolidate here.
Is that a railhead?
It's right near a railhead, yeah. In fact, it's right next to this big export depot here, where they're further consolidated again and then exported. So just to go through the conclusions here, the results, I wasn't able to obviously link the individual log shipments, but I could link the corporate actors to corporate actors. And so I think it's fairly, I think I can say with some assurance that they're violating their wood procurement guidelines, that they're sourcing, at least working with companies that are sourcing wood from these high conservation value forests using sanitary logging licenses. In terms of a chain of custody, most of it was by identification. Identification was by sort and diameter. Segmentation, it was mixed early and often at these key nodes, and very little info on wood origin. So what you have is really the messiness of spatial distance and sort of actor complexity, which creates distance. So these are just some of the typologies of chain of custody patterns between Russia and China. So you have illegal loggers here, you have large timber companies, very much a complex array. And this isn't durable. These will shift very, very quickly. In other words, one of the driving patterns or reasons for this lack of durability is that Chinese manufacturers will buy based on availability and price. And so they don't have a lot of times durable partners in Russia. In other words, partners that are the same over time. So it makes it very hard to really map out where things are coming from because of this fluidity. So if we think about green claims in the consumer imaginary, well, it's very hard to check because they're what we call self-certifying, these companies. So just graduate students that have some time to go out in the forest. So in sense of the consumer in the eyes of the consumer imaginary, though, it becomes a double fetish. So the chair isn't just a chair, but it's a chair that's an old-growth free chair, but it's fetishized because it's opaque, right? So the environmental relations remain obscured in this case. So in a sense, is this buyer-driven governance? Well, it is in the consumer imaginary, and it may be even in the retailer's imaginary. Maybe they are thinking that they do have governance because they are telling their Chinese suppliers that they want wood from certain places. But the sheer complexity and the fluidity of this business model is such that it's going to be very difficult to make much progress. What happens is these international retailers are basically shifting responsibility to the Chinese manufacturing, saying, this is our procurement policy, now you go implement it, right? But they don't understand, maybe they do understand the business model, but they aren't committed to it, okay? So I think it is still possible. It requires much more of a detailed understanding of the specific case of where the wood is coming from and understanding this production-consumption dynamic more fully. And I'll give you one example of how I think it can be done. There are some suppliers like IKEA who are what we call territorially embedded. They are so committed to production in Northeast China and they rely on very specific species that they are going to get their wood from Russia. There's no way around it. They can't shift to another country. They have such high volumes, and the geography is such that they really are heavily dependent. So in a sense, their bed is made in Northeast Asia. If we were to think about reconfiguring the supply chain, what would be required would be an active part, say on the retailer's part, to actually develop wood procurement policies and actually work directly at the forest floor. It's the only way. So you're really looking at simplifying the supply chain using large companies, right? And actually intervening and actually perhaps in Walmart actually starting to do this. They're actually looking at forest concessions in Russia and linking up Chinese manufacturers actually to the site of production. So very much simplifying the supply chain. Now you can think about social justice issues with this though, because you've got all these small actors in Russia and in China that are dependent on these supply networks. So you're really looking at consolidating a supply chain that will benefit large corporations and companies at the expense of some of the smaller operators. So it's a complicated question. So thank you, and questions?
Thank you.